long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Duke Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series. My name is constant reader Scott Daly, and this is the monster I share a brain with, Matt Freeman.
That's at Unfreeman to you.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I'm sure you have a perfectly reasonable explanation for why you have weird blank spots in your head.
Of course, I went for a walk.
It's a great walk.
Yeah.
This week on the show, we are concluding part 2 of book 2, The Drawing of the Three, entitled The Lady of Shadows. We'll be discussing chapter 4, Detta on the Other Side, and then the interlude of this part called Reshuffle. In the dead of night, Detta returns and proceeds to make the lives of Roland and Eddie absolutely miserable as they trek across the sands heading towards the third and final door. Roland's infection is back with a vengeance, and all three get weaker as the trek goes on. Finally, Odetta returns, and with her, hope. Eddie is forced to run back and forth, rushing each injured party member to the door, which is entitled The Pusher. When he finally gets there with Roland, Odetta has vanished, and Detta is hiding in the wings, ready to pounce as Roland walks through that final door. Matt, what'd you think about this week's reading?
I mean, this is awesome. This is so tense, complicated. So many interesting character interactions between these 3/4 characters. Mm-hmm. Just the level of tension, and like this is yet again one of those weeks where when we ended, I was just like, this is the worst. This is just the worst. This is the best revenge you could have had on me.
It's great. I think we have noticed that many of our listeners have not had the fortitude that you've had and have just gone ahead. I think some of them are already on book 4. So that's completely understandable. But yeah, I mean, this is the first time in this book that we've been in Roland's world the entire reading, right? Every other time we've kind of been jumping back and forth between worlds, but this one we're just in Roland's world. We're just on the beach, and there's a lot of very interesting dynamics going on here between Detta and Odetta and our two other characters. And I don't know, man, like it's just, I know we say this every week, but I'm just having a great time. Like this reread for me is just better than I could have ever hoped for.
Yeah, he really had a lot of fun exploring the interactions between these 3 or 4.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop making that joke at some point, but between these characters, and I mean, I feel like there's a reason for it. Like I feel like maybe they're about to add another character to the mix, and he wanted to sort of play out all of the dynamics of in this cohort first. That's just a thought.
Yeah, I mean the idea that like we give everyone plenty of time with both Detta and Odetta to kind of get that out of the way. Well, that doesn't seem fair. Not get it out of the way, but allow the story to focus on that.
Yeah.
To slow down, stay in one place for a little while and focus on that before everything gets crazy again. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Cool. Well, let's just jump right into it because we got to talk about Detta Walker, who is a fascinating character, and I think the stuff that King is doing with her is just delicious. I can't wait to explore this with you.
Let's do it.
All right, so we begin chapter 4, Detta on the Other Side, and this week's reading begins with this extremely troubling statement. "You must be on your guard," the gunslinger said, and Eddie had agreed. But the gunslinger knew Eddie didn't know what he was talking about. The whole back half of Eddie's mind, where survival is or isn't, didn't get the message. The gunslinger saw this. It was a good thing for Eddie. He did. And if I had to summarize these next 2 sections, Matt, I think it would be the idea of you must be on your guard and the idea of Eddie Dean continuously failing to really understand that message. It is the words that start and begin this week's reading. It's right here at the beginning here. It's what we close this week's reading out at the end. And so as we go through it, I want to kind of focus on the areas in which Eddie Dean is not on his guard and why that may be, and what King is kind of trying to explore with this concept of Eddie not understanding this, and maybe it being a way in which King is drawing a difference between Eddie and Roland.
For sure, he's kind of a softie here, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it really feels like Eddie sort of becomes the main character for this week's reading. Like we do get these Roland moments, but they mostly center around Eddie or Roland's own sickness, which is not really that dramatic. The moments of insight into Detta are fairly rare because I think it's more tense with her being somewhat mysterious, and us not really getting a lot of insight into what's going on in her mind. And then when Odetta shows up, we still don't really see much into her head. So like we follow Eddie when he leaves Roland, and then we follow Eddie again when he leaves Odetta at the door. So even though the Lady of Shadows is our new character, Eddie is really getting a lot of the focus here. And I think it's warranted that we pay attention to him in this discussion.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think you're absolutely right that Eddie is our focus, and Eddie is the person, like, if you think about it, Eddie is the person that's interacting with these two women more. I mean, like, Roland is there, and Roland is like trying to problem solve the issue that is Detta and Odetta being two people existing in one body, but really he's not interacting with them at all. And I mean, I think King creates a specific reason for that both of these women are terrified of Roland, for I think a very fascinating reason that we'll get into. But it is Eddie that is dealing with Detta Walker, and it is Eddie that is forming a relationship with Odetta Holmes, and neither of those aren't Eddie bonds with Roland in this chapter. That definitely happens, but Roland does not bond with anyone but else. Like he just, I don't think he has more than a couple words worth of conversation to either of these women in this entire section. Yeah,
it's really Eddie that is drawing Odetta into their group, if you will.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And I think that, like, you know, I keep going back to this question that I posed to you very early on in this book, which is why these people, why in this order? And we kind of answered that last week with Eddie's, like, being here helps precipitate what's happening with Detta and Odetta. And I think we're seeing even more of that here now, where, like, if Eddie wasn't here, what would Roland be doing with Odetta or Detta? Like how would he be handling that? It would be completely different experience.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this will be an even more interesting conversation if maybe we pick up another person from this next door, and then if that does happen, then we can say, like, all right, what would have been different if these doors had been opened in different orders?
Right.
And I suspect it'll turn out to be the case that it would have mattered quite a bit, and things would have worked, maybe not worked out at all if they hadn't been opened in this order.
Yeah, sure. All right, so we then go to Detta, awake and in control again, and she's waking up in the middle of the night, and we get this really interesting part where Detta is remembering earlier in the night and what happened, and she's remembering when these two men tied her to the chair and forced her to eat monster meat, which she describes it as, which is just the lobster meat, and then she talks about the really bad man and how he taunted her, and that's Roland, and he taunted her with a lot of slurs, and then they roasted, like, good beef in front of her and ate it in front of her, and of course none of this happened. Like, none of this actually happened, but King is using his strategy of jumping forward in time, which is something that we've seen over and over again in this book, where this story starts at the beginning of something that we haven't seen yet, and then we jump back to kind of clarify what did and didn't happen. And I think that works really well here, because in this opening chapter, you're hearing Detta say these things, and you're like, wait, they didn't really do those things, did they? And you're like, oh, of course they didn't. But for a second there, you're a little confused.
Yeah, I think maybe it was something in the audiobook reader's tone, but I was just like, okay, we're in one of the pretend memories now. I get it.
Sure.
I don't think I bought it for a second, but yeah, I mean, it's very, this idea that they make up the memories of when they're not there, and then they really believe that that's what happened, I think is really fascinating, because like. Mm-hmm. Like if Detta, for example, has all of these false memories of all these terrible things happening that never happened, then that's maybe why she is so hateful. Like,
sure.
Like not just in this context, but throughout her life. Like all of the time that Odetta takes from her, she's filling in with stuff like this potentially, where people are shouting slurs at her and everything. And it's why and how that works is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think when we get to Odetta a little bit later this week, we'll see the ways in which their memory construction works, and how that, you know, defines them as characters, but also defines the world that they live in. Yeah. All right.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So, I mean, I think it's such a fun device because like we see similarities and differences between the two of them. Like Detta remembers Eddie being awful, and Odetta remembers him being patient and kind. But both of them, though, remember Roland being angry and shouting and being just bad in some ineffable way. And I think that's the commonality, if anything, is the thing that stands out the most, because they're so opposite in every way that their kind of animosity toward Roland being the same is really, something to latch onto and try to figure out.
Yeah, and I love how like King plants that idea in your head of this weirdness that both of these women disagree on everything except that one thing, and then it's like a mystery, and then he solves that mystery in a really interesting way. Like why do they fear this man so much? And I love what the answer ends up being. I can't wait to talk about that. It's basically the idea that he is linked to them, and through him they have seen glimpses of each other, and that terrifies them to their core. It's just a fun idea. I really like it.
Yeah, I agree.
So Detta here sees Roland's guns left out near Eddie, and she crawls over to them and then places the guns to Eddie's head. And then we do this really cool move where we cut over to Roland, who is awake and watching this all. We then flash back in time to see that Roland knew this thing was coming the entire time, because he looked at Eddie as he warned him and knew that Eddie was not going to take his advice and not be on his guard. So he loaded his gun with blanks, or spent rounds rather, and he put them like right in Detta's path, like he's baiting her to act a little bit. And it's really interesting because we'll see like he's doing all this to turn a lesson, or to teach a lesson to Eddie. But in this moment, as he's sitting here watching this, there's two things that really jumped out to me here, and I wanted to talk to you through both of them. So the first one here is, as Roland is watching Detta, he saw her begin to raise the gun. She did this with less effort than Eddie had shown for the first time. Roland saw him do the same thing and point it towards Eddie. Then she paused, her face filled with an inexpressible cunning. In that moment, she reminded him of Martin.
That's so great. She's so deliberate and precise, right?
Yeah.
So now the connection between Detta and the Man in Black is fully textual here.
Right.
And you have to wonder if that means anything beyond just, Roland sees them both as cunning, evil people.
Yeah.
Like, does this imply that the pair of them serve the same master or the same force, like subtextually? I don't think it's that direct, because Detta, we see into her head. She doesn't seem to serve anybody. She's just being Detta. She doesn't seem like the type to be the servant of anything. But having them compared like that really kind of piqued my curiosity and made me think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, as a rule, King is not, he doesn't get into the gray as far as good and evil very much. King is very much a writer that creates evil, that evil is evil, and it is bad because it is bad, and that's just the way it works. But Detta is an interesting character in this, because I do think he kind of peppers this book with interesting ideas about how, yes, she's monstrous and cruel and awful, but like, if you look at it from another angle, you can kind of get it. You kind of, and I find that really interesting, because I think Roland wants to link Detta to the Man in Black, because he's an unquestionable evil, and then it can just be, well, this is evil, it's bad because it's bad, and I have to defeat it. But I think we'll see in this section that Roland also recognizes a strength in Detta that he could use. It's just uncontrollable. So I think we're kind of seeing him process through his feelings about who this person is.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear you say that he doesn't really deal in grays, because I think I know what you mean by that, because so many of King's antagonists are like demonic monsters or kind of something evil beyond human comprehension. But like, setting that aside, we've got this extremely amoral seeming gunslinger who allows a child to die for the sake of his mission. We've got a kid who is a heroin smuggler, and which isn't evil, but he was working with mobsters and so forth. Like he was on a bad path, and so it's interesting that I feel like both of these characters are pretty gray. And the fun thing about Detta and Odetta is that maybe they're two sides of a coin, but they almost balance out into something that is gray. So
yeah, I mean, maybe it's better to define this as human beings are complicated gray like messes. But there are forces in this world for good and evil that influence them. Like a human being is not good or evil, but they can be swept up in forces that are like uncomplicated in their evilness or their goodness. Like King is not super religious of a person, but he does like I think like the idea of like bad and the idea of good as these forces in the world is definitely something. Whether or not he believes in them, it's something he peppers his stories with for sure.
Yeah, I think that feels right. I mean, it's interesting how like we don't really know anything super evil that the Man in Black has done, but just kind of the way Stephen King writes, we're just like, yeah, but he probably did a lot of really bad shit we didn't see. Yeah. Like I'm not waiting for a big shocking reveal that he's not all that bad. Actually, like it's just I don't think that's the game he's playing here.
Yeah, but I mean, we also have to remember that the Man in Black says to Roland at the end of the last book that he's only working for someone else.
That's true.
Like he's just a pawn of a greater power, a greater evil, if you want to call it. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's something we should keep in mind as we go through the story, because I do think like the interaction of people and forces of evil and how those forces corrupt or that corruption is defeated, I think is an important thing that these books are exploring.
Yeah, totally.
All right, so the other bit that we wanted to talk about is this one here, where Roland is still watching her, and the text says, "But she swung the cylinder back, began to cock the hammer, and then paused again, paused for the wind to mask the single low click. He thought, here is another. God, she's evil, this one, and she's legless, but she's a gunslinger, as surely as Eddie is one." And that's first of all, like I totally forgot that this quote was talking about evil in it before we had that whole big conversation about good and evil in King's World. But I don't know, like this idea that once again, you know, here, first of all, that he calls Eddie a gunslinger. Like I think at one point he says you could become a gunslinger, but here this is like him stating it. Like Eddie is a gunslinger. That's who he is. And here's another one of his three, and she's a gunslinger. And I think that goes into your idea that you said last week about the Lady of Shadows being Detta, being this is the one that he wanted to draw. This is the gunslinger right here.
Or so he thinks right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's definitely foreboding that he thinks of Detta as a gunslinger, but we haven't seen the same level of admiration toward Odetta, unless I'm missing something. That's kind of, I mean, I think we talked a bit last week about this idea that it's a bit worrying that he might end up favoring Detta over Odetta because she's more useful to him, which is kind of a terrifying thought.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't seem like that's the way it's going to go, though. I think at least in this section, we kind of see that he recognizes the strength of Detta, but the value of Odetta in a method of control.
Yeah, that's a good point. So just to kind of be meta for a second, I think there's something really fun about this trope that King is using here. And I don't know what the name of it would be, but it reminds me of the story, the movie 3:10 to Yuma, where the idea is that some cops have nabbed the bad guy, and now they have to like deal with the bad guy as they go on a trek and deal with all the ensuing clever subterfuge and resistance without actually ever hurting or killing the bad guy that they've caught. And this is sort of that trope, except it's twisted up in a bunch of ingenious ways that make it even more interesting because your bad guy is one half of a personality.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting. I never put the 3:10 to Yuma connection in there, but I do like that is kind of a Western trope, kind of like sliding back into our Western fantasy story here. I do agree. I mean, I think that is the struggle of this chapter, is the two of them dealing with their prisoner and how terrible she is.
So I just made this connection. I can't believe it took me till now, but you've got two characters who are friends, one of them clearly in the master position, the other one in the subservient position, traveling with a creature with two personalities to go somewhere. I mean, she hasn't had the conversation where she talks to Smeagol yet, but I wonder if we're getting to the Smeagol Gollum conversation.
I'm so glad you got there, Matt. we hadn't talked about Lord of the Rings in a couple weeks, right?
And I was regretting that. And I thought about it last week. I just didn't really see anything. And now that I've seen this, it seems quite obvious. So I think the thing is I wasn't expecting this to happen so soon because I was expecting more of a like 1-to-1 mapping. But yeah, this is that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like I wonder I wonder like how much of this is intentional. Like, you know, like I mean, certainly Stephen King has talked about his love of Lord of the Rings. Did he construct these characters this way on purpose, or was it like subconscious influence over his story that he wasn't even conscious of when he first wrote it? I don't know.
Right. I mean, and it's not like the difference there was that Gollum was leading them and then was going to betray them, whereas this is a much more like she's someone who they've kidnapped and need for some purpose. So, I mean, and I don't know if this is going to go somewhere. You know, it may become more Lord of the Rings like at some point. But I mean, definitely we've got a lot of these specific elements here.
Yeah, I mean, thematically it doesn't really line up, but I think just structurally it's definitely there.
Yeah, for sure.
I love that. So back to our standoff here. Roland watches as Detta pulls the trigger and realizes that the gun won't fire. Then she raises the gun as a club. Roland continues to watch as Detta swings down at Eddie screaming, watches as Eddie moves out of the way at the last moment and catches him on the jaw. Roland is doing this whole thing, as we said, just to teach Eddie a lesson. He quotes Court here when he says, "A child doesn't understand a hammer until he's mashed his finger at a nail." And I love that idea that like this whole scene played out really just to be like, Eddie, I told you to be on your guard and you didn't listen to me. And look, here I've constructed a problem for you because I knew this was going to happen. And look, it did. It happened exactly like I thought it was. And he doesn't jump in. Roland does not jump in until he's like, okay, Eddie's learned the lesson now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hardcore. And it's this tough love thing. And I think that there's this interesting thing where he both is sort of trying to shape Eddie up into a stronger and better person. And there's a kind of love there.
Yeah.
But like also it's their relationship is just so complicated because he's not just like, God damn it, Eddie, I told you, like it's a teaching moment for him, you know?
Yeah. I mean, he's moved into the court position kind of, right? I mean, that's kind of the identity he's assumed here now is he's like, and he's slotting into that very nicely.
It reminds me of how Court was. And we even talked about this. I think the idea that Court, like at first I was like, this guy's just an asshole. And then, and then I kind of came around on him and was like, I think that Court just understands that this is a harsh world. And if he's not a harsh taskmaster, then he's not doing his pupils, good service.
Yeah, totally.
And here Roland is like, she's really, really dangerous. You really need to watch out. And then he's going to make sure that Eddie internalizes this lesson.
Yeah, and he will yell at him here too because they bind Detta and then Roland chides Eddie for not listening and then asks him if he truly believes him now all the way to the bottom. Yes, he said, God, yes. This woman is a monster. Eddie begins to cry. The gunslinger wanted to comfort him, could not commit such a sacrilege. He remembered Jake too well, and walked off into the dark with his new fever burning and aching inside of him. So, I mean, this is great, right? Like, there's, like, we were talking about, like, Court was this taskmaster who also had this love for these kids, and Roland has that for Eddie, but he like, we talked last week about how he's terrified of, or he wants love so much, and here he balks at it. He sees it and is like, and calls it a sacrilege, because he feels like he loved Jake and got too close to Jake and then had to do that. So like, it's very much, I'm of the opinion that I'm going to have to sacrifice this person and therefore am not going to make the same mistake last time. And the change is not don't sacrifice the person.
Right.
The change is don't name the puppy before I sacrifice it.
Yeah. We're continuing the thread from last week as Roland desperately wishes for love and human connection with these people that he's drawn, but then he feels this terrible distance from them and he won't let himself get close to them because he thinks he might have to sacrifice them, like you said.
Yeah.
And I was trying to like draw some kind of connection between his worsening physical sickness and sort of this spiritual sickness, which I see him as struggling with here. Like, I don't think I can really map it out very well, but like I feel like I want to say like the sicker, the more he rejects connection and love and humanity with these two, the sicker he gets.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a whole bunch. I mean, we do see in this, I think it is not an accident that the text here points out in this moment where Eddie is crying in front of him and he wants to comfort him and he tells himself no. The text points out what is burning inside of him, not love, not compassion, but the fever and aching. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's an accident. I don't think King constructed that sentence like that without intent there. So I think you're onto something there, and I think we should pay attention to that, especially as we move into the final door next week and see where hopefully Roland will get the cure for the fever that's burning inside of him, and what that will look like. Because I think if your connection here is correct, then those two things should link in some way. Yeah,
and you know, the best I can do so far though is like he got the antibiotics when he got Eddie, and then they had kind of a good relationship, and then at a certain point things got worse and they ran out of medicine, and yeah, I think you're right. I think if it's going to hold up, then we need to know what happens with the next door. So we'll just put a pin in that.
Yeah, sure. All right, we then flash back again to an earlier discussion that Roland and Eddie are having about Detta and Odetta. Eddie figures that she might be a schizophrenic, which I guess was technically, I don't even think it was technically correct in 1987. We talked about this last week, but definitely pop psychology, it was.
Yeah,
that was
like
the common.
According to movies, right? Yeah.
Right. And Roland, about learning what schizophrenia is, agrees with that assessment. They recognize that this weird feeling that Eddie felt when he both looking through the door, that placental tearing we talked about last week, made him feel like a schizo, and that both Detta and Odetta probably saw it too. And then we get this really great quote here. That was what he had sensed as they came through. That was what had happened to her. No, not just her, them. For a moment, Detta and Odetta had looked at each other, not the way one would look at her reflection in a mirror, but as separate people. The mirror became a window pane, and for a moment Odetta had seen Detta, and Detta had seen Odetta, and had been equally horror-struck. They each know, the gunslinger thought grimly. They may not have known before, but they do now. They can try to hide it from themselves, but for a moment they saw, they knew, and that knowing must still be there.
Yeah, and I think this hints that there's going to be some reckoning in the future. But we haven't seen anything like that, though. I mean, both of them seem to still be quite in denial. And we know there's another door ahead, and Roland will open it at the end of this section. So maybe that door could serve as another opportunity for them to see each other. Potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair conclusion to make. If the way that these two first, for maybe the first time in their life, became aware of each other's existence was through the magic of the door and Roland drawing them, then maybe the answer is to do that again somehow. Right.
I mean, maybe I'm being too picky or detail oriented or whatever, but I noticed that when they got Detta through the door, they slammed it like immediately, and thus it and then it disappeared, and then there was no capacity to use it as a kind of mirror or this is just a possibility. This is in my mind. Yeah.
No, I like that.
So I think I have another prediction though. I think that all three of these people will end up in the world of the Pusher. I think maybe this book ends with all of them having left Roland's world behind. I'm not sure, but it seems like one thing we haven't really seen yet is a cycle where Roland physically crosses into another world for an extended period of time, more than just like a brief gunfight. And that might be fun to see. This prediction is based mostly on just like King seems to be doing different and creative and interesting things with each of these people. And I'm like, well, what is the thing that we haven't seen yet? Well, that's what we haven't seen yet. So that's why I say that.
Okay, cool. I like that.
Okay.
I like that. Cool. Before we move on, I just want to kind of focus on the text here in this quote I read. I like, first of all, the names, we made fun of this in the intro, but the names Odetta and Detta just have a rhyme to it, like, and I think King uses that. Like, reading that out loud, like for a moment, Odetta had seen Detta and Detta had seen Odetta. And there's just like, there's a cadence to that I really, really enjoyed. Like I liked reading that passage. It was like, oh, this is such good writing. It made me feel good to read that out loud. So I really enjoyed how King like took these two names and then has used them and used like, it's this concept of duality, and he's repeating their names again and again, rhyming off of each other in really fun ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the name last week, but I think it's fascinating that their names aren't like Odetta and Sally. Their names are
right.
Odetta and Detta, but then Holmes versus Walker. Like they have different last names, but the same name, essentially the same first name. It's just a nickname version. And I think it's just interesting. It begs the question, like why are their names that way? Like where did, if the real name of this body is Odetta Holmes, where did the name Walker come from? I mean, I feel like that's something that I'm actually genuinely curious about.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, if we look at their names, like, first of all, the fact that Detta is missing a letter that makes her Odetta, it literally becomes Detta is missing something, is not a complete person.
Yeah.
Because she's missing some core that makes Odetta. She's missing the O. And like Holmes, I believe, is like the meaning of that last name is like island, I think. So Walker, like we've already talked about the irony of Walker being the last name of someone who gets their legs chopped off and cannot walk anymore. Right. But like the idea that Holmes is an island and Walker like
a traveler.
And the island is inaccessible. Like a good like you get a feeling of why these two literally cannot meet because one person is walking, one person is on this island. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I was wondering about that actually, like what does Holmes mean? Yeah, thanks for pulling that out.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing about this is Odetta Holmes is not a created name, right? That is the name of who this person was.
Yeah.
But Detta Walker, every bit of that is created by this personality. So I think it's much more likely that the meaning, the importance and the meaning of the names is more on the Detta Walker side, as that's a choice that this personality made at some point. Mm-hmm. Or was made for her. Sure.
I mean, that's fun because there's a Watsonian and Doylistic level on which the names are created. Because, I mean, Roland has a certain meaning. Even Eddie, Dean. I mean, I don't remember if we pointed this out, but like Edward and Henry are both English king names, right?
Yeah.
So there's a certain kind of nobility to their names. Mm-hmm. I don't know about Dean. I didn't look that up. But I wouldn't be surprised to find that King has put a lot of meaning and purpose into all these names that he's chosen, even the ones that are seemingly innocuous.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I will have to look up what Dean means. I'm not sure myself.
Okay.
I mean, besides the college definition.
Right.
All right. So back in the present, Roland thinks about how these two sides will need to come to battle, he describes. And whichever side, the bright or the dark, wins could spell doom. Roland, even though he's saying that Detta winning could be doom, recognizes that certain quality in Detta that he would use, a toughness, the gunslinger in her that he noticed earlier. He says it would be better to create a joining of them, but how? So we're kind of going to this idea that like, we don't want Odetta to win. I mean, we do want Odetta to win in this battle because we like Odetta better. But really what they need, what would be the best is if Odetta and Detta become one person.
Right. It's cool to have Roland like kind of being very practical about this, where he's like, I need to fix this problem. We need to create a joining. But I don't know. I'm thinking this will either involve the door, like I said a minute ago, or something else that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah. All right. So the next morning, we begin our journey, Matt. We start our journey towards door number 3, and Detta proves to be just about as much of a monster as our characters suspected she would be, as their pushing the wheelchair along the beach, they're already struggling because it's wheels on sand. And then pushing a woman who doesn't want to be pushed is near impossible. And Detta is making that as true as possible. And I want to step back before we move on from this. I want to step back and look at this scene from some different angles, because Detta is a monster. King has made that clear. He said it over and over again. And like we talked about, he doesn't really deal with a lot of the ambiguity of evil in his story. Evil stuff is evil, good stuff is good. The Lady of Shadows is a fractured person. Odetta seems to be the light side of that, the good side of that. Detta is the bad side of it, the evil side of it. That seems to be what he's created here, right?
Yeah. I think that makes sense. It tracks for sure.
Yeah, but Roland has yanked this woman out of her world without her consent. He's imprisoned her on this beach and is demanding that she listens and follow, and then restraining her when she doesn't listen. And if you think back, when we first met Odetta, she was returning from a trip to Oxford where she was arrested, locked away, and restrained. Why was she arrested, locked away, and restrained? Because of who she was. She was a black woman stepping out of her place. And here we have Detta, who is locked up and restrained again. Why? Because of who she is, right? Because she is one of the three. She is a plaything of Ka or whatever. She was like, her agency was taken away, and now she's being ordered around by people and has no say in it.
Well, I love that. I mean, one thing that really stood out to me throughout this whole section is that there's no rational reason for Detta to do this. Like it's sure. It's just spite, because she can't survive without them. But she hates them so much that she's just going to be a bull in a china shop and sabotage them at every turn. And I think like the explanation for that is exactly what you said. Like to her, this is some form of like fighting for her view of what is right, perhaps.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, because I think if you look at Detta is the rage and the powerlessness that Odetta feels in the world made manifest. She in fact, like I think we see that kind of explicitly in that Detta feeds off of the kind of reversal of standard power dynamics. It's why King shows her sexual desire fed by putting people in their place, right? We see her break the plate. We see her like kind of feed off like she like turns things around on men that are more powerful than her, and like that arouses her. She feeds off of that. And here she's doing what Odetta can't, and doing kind of what Eddie did at first too. She's protesting violently against this situation. Like Detta is like trying to stop them from doing what they're doing. Odetta sat silently in a cell and pissed herself because that's her form of protest. Detta's form of protest is violent, is aggressive. This is what she's doing. And it's so funny to me that we paint this because we're in the perspective of Roland, who we want to see get to the end of his quest because we're kind of starting to like him, of Eddie, who we've grown to like. And from their perspective, this is just a person being difficult. And why is she being difficult? Why is she making this hard on our characters? But from her perspective, she's protesting enslavement.
Right. Yeah, she was kidnapped. And yeah. I mean, it may not be rational in the sense that it's going to probably result in her death if she succeeds, right? But sure. But I think she's the kind of person who is willing to burn it all down to spit in the face of the people who are being unjust. Yeah. And that's all extremely fascinating. I mean, you're right, because Odetta has committed herself to this path of nonviolent resistance. Mm-hmm. You know, she's this woman who suffers not only under the burden of racial prejudice, but also these two different terrible violent attacks that left her with brain damage and with, recurring headaches and then without legs. And Odetta just remains so stolid and sanguine and peaceful, with none of the rage and resentment that would be fully justified by having lived this life, by having had these experiences. And so all that rage and resentment for all of these horrible things that have happened to her seem to have just been shunted into Detta. And that's perfect. That's like a great explanation, I think.
Yeah, I love it. I love it so much. And I think this is really the first time reading the book that I really clued into that. And I think it's just like, I think King is definitely meaning for you to get there, I think. But you have to kind of step back and look at this situation from her perspective. And I love that, like, he doesn't let you do that very much. Like, when we are in Detta's head, it's really just cruelty and malice, because she is just the physical manifestation of that like passive resistance. And so we don't see the plan behind it, but it is there. It is like, I think it is fundamentally true that these people have taken her from her home and are forcing her to roll along a beach now. For what purpose? She didn't agree to this. Like, at least Eddie said yes before Roland brought him in here. She was just plucked out of the world, and she's here now.
I'm not even sure if they've told her, like, there's a tower we're trying to get to.
They haven't even explained. I think Eddie tried to, right? And Odetta didn't listen. And of course, they haven't explained anything to Detta at all. She's not letting them, but yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's awesome.
It's fascinating. I love it. As they move on, Roland continues to get sicker. Detta refuses to eat. She's going on a hunger strike, which is another fun form of passive resistance there, Matt.
Yep.
And even Eddie starts to look worse for wear because it turns out a diet of Detta chumps, it's not good for you in the long term. So I love that Roland describes this as neck deep in water and just treading water. But what I really like here is what we're seeing is this kind of bond forming between the gunslinger and Eddie. And this is fascinating to me because we started out at the very beginning of this book with Eddie realizing very, very quickly that he's going to fall in love with this dude and love him like a brother. He got there very, very fast. And then the circumstances changed. He was sucked into this world. He was suffering withdrawal from his drugs and really started to resent and hate Roland. Now, King has given them a common enemy, Detta. And in that commonality, a bond forms. And I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I was thinking along the lines of, like, why were these people drawn in this order? It's like, well, this gives them a project to work on together, basically. And we do see them become closer and closer. And it sort of, despite Roland's, best efforts, he just keeps kind of letting down his guard and like laughing and showing involuntary signs of affection toward Eddie.
I love this moment where he claps him on the shoulder, and the book says a gesture of affection so rare it made Eddie blink.
Yeah.
It's just like it's so beyond the norm for Roland to do here, and that Eddie is kind of shocked by it. And I think you're right that we don't get to see in Roland's head here, but we did see it earlier when he wanted to comfort an Eddie, and here Eddie is once again in need of comfort, and Roland gives it to him. He claps him on the shoulder. He makes a joke. They laugh and smile, and then like the gunslinger looks at him smiling and says, "I'm going to turn in," and then we get another beat of our "Be on your guard" moment here. It's really against Roland's better wishes. He's starting to really like this kid.
Yeah. Yeah, the ever-shifting dynamic between these two is just an endless delight. The constant ebb and flow of their love and resentment for each other. It's like the tides that bring in the lobstrosities.
Oh, I like that.
Later on, Eddie will explicitly compare Roland to Henry. And it really is kind of a big brother, little brother dynamic that they've established here. And I mean, the thing is, brothers aren't always friendly.
Sure.
But underneath whatever's going on between them, the love is always there. And that is the main thing that strikes me about this dynamic.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, the bickering that siblings have, I think we are seeing it here, in that there's like moments of real frustration and anger at each other, but then moments of mutual respect and love as well. Yeah, it's really great. So at one point, Eddie and Roland are talking about Detta and come to a realization, the same realization that you and I had last week when King kind of hinted towards it, that the way she talks is just an act. Eddie says that was an act, and she knew it was an act, but she's a pretty good actress, and she fooled us both for a few seconds. The way she's talking is an act too, but it's not as good. It's so stupid, so goddamn hokey. You believe she pretends well only when she knows she's doing it? Yeah, she sounds like a cross between the darkies in this book called Mandingo I read once, and Butterfly McQueen and Gone with the Wind. I know you don't know these names, but what I mean is she talks like a cliche. Do you know that word? It means what is always said or believed by people who think only or a little or not at all. Yeah, I couldn't have said it half so good. So, I mean, we get this moment, Matt, where basically what we theorized, which is that this cartoonishly sounding black affect that Detta is putting on is totally fake.
Yeah. I'm going to get real nerdy for a second and point out that if Roland comes from another dimension entirely or from like the distant past, then he wouldn't speak almost exactly right English, including French loanwords, like cliche. And the written script that he reads wouldn't be the same as English script. But anyway, that's just, whatever. He's from the future. There's of course this implication that the way Detta speaks is like bad acting because she doesn't realize that she's doing it. Like it's fake, but it's not intentionally fake. So it's what this personality genuinely thinks she should speak like. Yet it's somehow not genuine. And I think it's interesting because it's ambiguous, and I still think that there's a mystery behind this. Like why did she do this? If if she's not doing it on purpose, what is the cause?
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting. And I the concept of like you're better at acting when you know you're doing it is really fascinating to me, because like it almost seems like it would be the opposite, right? When you're conscious of the fact that you're putting on a performance, it seems like you'd be worse at it. But that it is the opposite with Detta. When she is aware that she's doing it, she's better. When she's not aware that she's doing it, she comes off as hokey and fake, which is what everything she says sounds like. It sounds fake. Nobody talks like this.
Yeah. I don't know. I find myself wondering if the brick that hit Odetta really has anything to do with Detta. Mm-hmm. Like I get that that's the obvious cause. Like that's what we're supposed to think. But what if it's just a convenient red herring? What if this like blue plate experience was some kind of supernatural event that birthed Detta as a way of protecting Odetta from something? I get that I'm being, galaxy brain here, but I do feel like we're going to get some kind of blue plate like flashback. We're going to explain who this blue woman is and get a better sense of what this thing is that Detta is responding to. Like the idea that just a brick hit her and now she's schizophrenic. It's like, well, that could be it. Sure. It doesn't feel very Stephen King, and admittedly my impression of Stephen King is not the most accurate in the world, but that's just kind of my feeling right now.
Sure. Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I think King has telegraphed the importance of the blue plate like 6 times by now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it is fair to say that he's trying to hint towards the reader that this is going to be something very important. And importantly, we've only seen this come from Detta, right? Like we have not seen Odetta Holmes mention the blue lady, mention the blue plate. I think there was one moment where she said something about like the word force special, which is a frequent word that Detta has. But I think that was like almost a moment of terror and confusion as like maybe the walls between the two were starting to break down and she pushes away from it. But I think the point is that it seems like something specific to Detta and Detta's memory and her life as she's constructed it.
Yeah, and that's why I have this idea that it was some really important event that perhaps literally created Detta as a way of protecting Odetta.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, to kind of maybe try to understand why King would have a character like Odetta that is putting on this this cartoonishly false and wrong black woman affect. We did get an email from a listener last week named Nadim who pointed out that this could just be King trying to show a character that's trying to represent how certain people imagine what a person of color would act like. Like Detta is putting on a show and giving the show of the mad black woman, right? That like this is maybe what King is trying to demonstrate here is like when a people of a certain type look at a black woman, this is what they would think that they would sound like, which is obviously ridiculous and false. And I find that interesting, an idea that like we have Odetta, who is a very rich and powerful woman, kind of fighting back against racism and trying to win rights for people of color, and then we have Detta, who is in some ways like living up to a stereotype.
Yeah, I mean, Detta literally lives in a different place, right?
Yeah,
like she's sort of going out of her way to live out that stereotype, or not sort of. I mean, I think that's literally what she's doing. And yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Except she's not doing it consciously. So that's at least not according to Roland and Eddie's interpretation. She's doing all of this, but she's not doing it consciously, and that just makes it more mysterious to me.
Yeah, I mean, you could get really galaxy brain with it and be like, well, yeah, Detta is not doing it consciously, but Odetta created Detta to put forth this stereotypical view.
Mm-hmm.
And I like I said, there's nothing in the text that directly says yes, that is the case, but something to think about for sure.
Sure, yeah.
There, I mean, like our discussion question last week talked about, there is a lot to do. Like King chose these women and had Odetta be someone in the civil rights movement for a reason. There's like, it's exploring stuff around this idea, and I think it's worth at least considering.
Sure.
All right, so at one point, Detta switches to another form of protest, Matt, screaming loudly in the middle of the night to interrupt everyone's sleep. Yay! It's definitely a scorched earth form of protest, just like refusing to eat, right? Because she's hurting them, but also depriving herself of sleep.
Yeah, and she's like tearing up her throat too.
Yeah. And it's working, though. It's definitely working until Roland approaches Detta, but doesn't talk to Detta about it. But oh, Detta. Roland stood before her for a moment. Roland stood before her, and for a moment Eddie was sure, completely sure, that the gunslinger had reached the end of his patience and would simply swat her like a fly. Instead, astoundingly, he dropped to one knee before her like a suitor about to propose marriage. "Listen," he said, and Eddie could scarcely credit the silky quality of Roland's voice. He could see much of the same deep surprise on Detta's face, only there was fear joined to it. "Listen to me, Odetta." I just love that. So he basically like looks into Detta's eyes, but speaks to Odetta and says to her, "I don't think this bitch would care if she did die on a hard gag. She wants to die, but maybe even more, she wants you to die. But you haven't died, not so far, and I don't think Detta is brand new in your life. And don't let her wake us up a third time, Odetta. I don't want to gag her, but I will if I have to." And it works. Like, we don't know if the reason it works is because he actually channeled Odetta and had her wrestle some amount of control, but it does work.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that reminds me that he does have these gunslinger hypnotism powers.
Sure. Yeah.
Like King makes much of his like affect and tone being completely different here. So maybe he did something special, something magical here.
Yeah. It's not the spinning the bullet we saw in the gunslinger, but
right.
Yeah, I do think you're right that like the silky quality of Roland's voice that they specifically draw attention to. Yeah,
I think we're meant to assume that there is some communication happened here, but maybe it was unconscious.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think the thing that King has established is that for the first time in both of their lives, Odetta and Detta are aware of each other on some level, and they're kind of running away from that knowledge.
Yeah.
Because I think we saw how like viciously Odetta reacted last week when Eddie like shortened her name to Detta.
Right.
So like they are aware of each other for the first time, and almost that wall between them is maybe starting to crumble or weaken, or as Roland phrased it, turn into a window.
Yeah. Right. I feel like it's inevitable at this point. They just need to have it kind of shoved in their faces a few more times, and then some reckoning will be needed.
Yeah. So the main idea of this chapter, i.e. Detta is the worst, continues with moments where the characters wake up and I think this happens several times throughout the chapter, Matt, where they wake up and are like, "Oh, I hope it's Odetta this morning." And you just hear Detta say, "Hi, boys."
Yeah.
You're just like, "Oh, fuck."
Yeah.
And she's just staring at them smugly. Like, I think King does such a great job of painting her like both as this like powerfully monstrous person who's like so smug at ruining all their lives, but also like slowly revealing how weak she's getting as well. I think he handles that really well.
Right. Like she's making them totally miserable, but you kind of almost admire her for it, because you're like, man, this must suck worse for you than it does for them even, and yet you're still doing it.
yeah, definitely. I mean, and it gets to a point where they are, or at least Eddie almost wishes she would just die. Like there's this moment where she wipes out on a sand dune and starts choking in the sand, and Roland rushes over and he's struggling to lift the chair up, and Eddie is just like, maybe I'll just hang back for a minute. And then, of course, for Eddie, the reason why he decides to help her up is Odetta. Then he remembered Odetta, although their encounter had been so brief and seemed so long ago that memory was growing dim, and moved forward to help. I love that moment. Like, for Roland, the death of Detta would be the death of his quest. So, like, he's never going to let this happen. But Eddie here has this moment. It's like, but it's because he has the hots for the other one. He's like, all right, fine.
Yeah. Eddie's not a great human being, but he's not a monster. So I think it's telling that she's pushed him so far that he actually thinks for a minute, like, yeah, maybe just let her die.
Yeah, I agree. It's rough. It's definitely like, I think that like most of, we're kind of speeding by it, but most of this chapter is just the day in, day out struggle of these two to just get 2 miles down the beach in one day with this woman who is constantly fucking their world up. And so, like, you get to that point where, I'm not condoning anyone kill someone or anything, but you get to that point where when Eddie hangs back briefly, you're like, yeah, I get it. I
think after a few days of this kind of thing, you would just snap. Yeah.
So as the beach is slowly hardening and turning into the hills that they're rapidly approaching, there is still no door and still more Detta. And there's this wonderful moment where Eddie hears the scream of a cat. And this is like the first non-lobstrosity they've heard or seen so far. I love the speculation here, Matt, because this cat is going to be the source of tension throughout all of the rest of this chapter. And really all we have to go on here regarding the animals in Roland's world, or at least this portion of Roland's world, is the lobstrosities, these tiny lobster creatures that have ridiculously razor sharp beaks. So I think your imagination kind of just goes nuts with what this like otherworldly cat could be.
Well, we also know that there's like threaded stock.
Sure,
and there's the slow mutants. So like, my current sense of his world is like baseline animals, but then mutated in weird ways that we can't imagine ahead of time. So like, it could be like cat base, and then in some weird direction that makes it scarier.
Yeah, it could just be like a normal mountain cat, or it could be a mutant mountain cat with super sharp claws.
Right. Yeah, it's such a cool idea to use cat for this, because like the scream of a big cat is the most unnerving sound in nature. I'm imagining a cougar's scream specifically, which I'm pretty sure that would turn me up to like 100% primate fight or flight mode if I heard that in the wilderness.
Yeah, and I love that like Roland is consistently like, you don't have to worry about that. It's just a cat. It's just like, it's probably not even that big. You don't have to worry about it. And I think you're kind of maybe reassured because this is Roland's world, and you would think that he would have that knowledge. But then Eddie calls him out on it and is like, I don't think you've ever been to this part of your world either.
Yeah.
and it's like, oh yeah, you haven't, Roland.
It's pretty funny
because you
because
know what that is.
Yeah, it's funny because it is just a guess by Eddie, but you know he's right. And so you're like, yeah. Roland.
It is like, and I don't want to get into the Shining or extrasensory stuff, but it is kind of remarkable how perceptive Eddie is when it comes to Roland. Like he's just got his number in every single way. Like not just about his obsession with the tower, but about like he seems to have this like powerful ability to call him on his shit.
I think he can just detect when he's full of shit. I think this is maybe even like, having lived with Henry for so long, he has a lifetime of practice at knowing when people are full of shit.
Yeah, certainly doesn't need to be an like superpower or anything. It could just literally be his experience. Yeah,
I think it could be either way, and I would like it either way, honestly.
Sure. So Roland is getting worse and looking dead in the morning, and I really love this description. Roland was getting slowly to his feet. He still looked to Eddie like a man using the rungs of an invisible ladder to make it. Eddie felt an angry sort of pity, and this was a familiar emotion, oddly nostalgic. After a moment, he understood. It was like when he and Henry used to watch the fights on TV, and one fighter would hurt the other, hurt him terribly, again and again, and the crowd would be screaming for blood, and Henry would be screaming for blood, but Eddie only sat there, feeling that angry pity, that dumb disgust. He'd sat there sending thought waves at the referee. Stop it, man. Are you fucking blind? He's dying out there, dying. Stop the fucking fight. There was no way to stop this one. I just love that. That's just fantastic writing.
Yeah, it's really good. It makes you like Eddie a little bit more too, because I've felt that way. Like, it's funny because I enjoy martial arts and I enjoy watching fights, but sometimes I'm like, okay, that's just too much. That's just sad.
Yeah, and everyone around him is these animalistic, like screeching for blood, and he's the only one. Like, there's this streak of kindness in him.
Yeah, I love it. So far, this book hasn't really tried to make Roland very likable, but it has successfully taken this badass from the last book and just made him pretty pitiful, which at least kind of dulls your ability to be mad at him, because he's continuing to soldier on despite all of his burdens and missing fingers and illness and everything. Sure. And that's just kind of intrinsically admirable. So I just think it's cool how the whole first book was like Roland, badass gunslinger, cool guy, hero. And as we talked about, first thing that happens in this book is he gets his fingers cut off and his toe cut off, which has got to make it hard to walk. Yep. And he's just been pathetic for most of this book, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is like powerful, and I agree. Like, it's an interesting way to try to win you over, Tim, because I do think that's King's goal here. Is I don't want you to hate this guy. I want to win you over to him, and putting him through the ringer is certainly a way to do that. But yeah, I mean, King, like, he's going back and forth with it, because there are moments when he's pitiable and when you feel bad for him, and then there are moments when he's like, I can't love these people because I'm gonna have to kill them, where you're just like, ugh, you've learned nothing, sir. And so I think he's a complex character, and that's part of the reason I do unabashedly love him, is that he is this like completely driven, like of one mind person, who also like wants these other things and just doesn't know how to go about getting them. He doesn't know how to go about being friends with Eddie. He just doesn't know. He doesn't get it, and it's kind of awkward, and I don't know. I just love it. I love Roland.
Yeah, he's very relatable and understandable. I always want to be really clear when I say stuff like the book isn't making him likable. Like, I just literally don't think King is going out of his way to make Roland likable. I think what he's doing is he's making him understandable. He's making him into someone that you can understand and inhabit, and who makes sense to you. And one thing I found about books throughout all of our projects is that that's kind of all you need to fall in love with a character. Like, they can be a pretty awful person, but if you understand them, then you will like them. That's just like a magic power of books. And so, yeah, I agree. I love Roland. I think he's a great character. I simultaneously think that he is being portrayed as being sort of an unlikable grouch in this book.
Sure, that's fair. That's definitely fair. All right, we move on to the next part, where Detta's head starts hurting, and then she starts feeling sick, and then she's suddenly screaming about the blue lady and her plate, and suddenly she's Odetta again. And as Odetta comes, Roland drops. And the question I have for you here, Matt, is we don't see anything specifically here that brings about the change. Like, there's no event that happens in the book that makes it clear why, like, the cruelty of Detta is going away and Odetta is coming back. Like, is it just time? Is it just she grew weak enough? Is it Ka? We don't really know.
Yeah, nothing specific really changes here, so I don't think the book wants us to know.
Sure. It
could just be like a certain amount of time passed, like you said, but doesn't feel very narratively satisfying. Mm-hmm. If it were weakness, then like Odetta should be equally weak. I really don't know. I want to talk for a minute about the idea that it might be Ka. Mm-hmm. Because so far I like the idea. I like how that idea has been used in this book as a way of talking about fate in a semi-supernatural way, using genre tropes to frame this theme of fate. But I also think it's risky to have that element be in the story. Because like I always think about the Wheel of Time, how there's this element and there's this idea in the Wheel of Time that some individuals are just chosen by fate to be Taverin, which translates to the protagonist. And that can be a dangerous thing to do in a story because it just reminds you that you're reading a story. It's like, why are they the protagonist? Because they need to be the protagonist so we can have the story. Like, it feels like stuff happens because the plot needs it to happen. And I definitely don't think King has crossed that line here or even come close to it, really, because Ka remains very mysterious to me and to the characters, and I want to learn more about it. But I don't know when something is Ka or just coincidence. And I think I like that. Like, I think I would actually like it less if it were really obvious when something was just fate, because then that would just be like, oh, just the author needed that to happen.
Sure. Well, I mean, the thing with Roland is that everything's going to be Ka to him. It's really great that we have two characters here. One of them, Roland, who's like entirely driven by this single pursuit for the tower, and everything that happens or doesn't happen is the will of fate in getting him to this moment. And then Eddie, who looks at the concept of Ka and just says Ka.
Yeah.
So like, I think if you asked Roland why Detta changed to Odetta in this moment, he would say, well, it's the will of Ka, of course. And he would question it none at all. He would like, that would be the end of the conversation for Roland. And so we do have this interesting thing where we don't know how much to believe him in that. Like, the book has not established Ka as a real presence in the story, other than there are these magic doors on the beach. But we don't know, we don't know where that came from. Was that Ka, or is that just some more magic spells that people are casting? We don't know.
It's a fascinating idea because it forces you to think about the idea that, like, maybe maybe Ka is not real. Like maybe Eddie's right. Maybe Roland is just lucky. Like, it's entirely possible to, like, in the real world, just live a very, very fortunate life and feel like I'm so thankful to, pick your poison, God or whatever. I'm so thankful to God for providing me with this wonderful life that I've had. And it's like, well, I mean, you're probably just really lucky. Like, that happens. Sometimes people are lucky. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a concept that King has introduced and reinforced over and over again. So it is going to matter narratively as we continue in the story. But the extent of which, I think, is left up to the reader, at least at this point in the story.
Yeah, and I think that's all I wanted to say is, like, I actually like the way it's been handled up to this point. I think I have faith that I will continue to like the way it's been handled. I just want to kind of talk about the idea that it can be a troublesome kind of thematic element to include in your story.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I've not read all the Wheel of Time books, but I've read enough to know exactly what you're talking about. So, yeah. All right. Well, that is the end of chapter 4, and we move into our, I guess we'll call it an interlude. It's called Reshuffle. So we're returning to a shuffle chapter, Matt. But interestingly enough, this shuffle chapter is not structured at all like the other one. In the first shuffle, there were no chapter or sub-chapter numbers. It was just this idea of shuffling mid-sentence, like someone's in the middle of talking or the narrator's in the middle of narrating, and then we get a shuffle. That doesn't have this at all. This is just structured like a normal chapter, except it's called Reshuffle. And I think this is because the shuffle here is not ongoing. It occurs at the start of the chapter as the deck is shuffled and Odetta ends up on the top of it again and seizes control again. And that's my interpretation of why this is not structured the same.
Yeah, I like that interpretation. I mean, if anything, the previous chapter with all of its flashbacks felt more shuffly.
Yeah. I mean, this one still does have flashbacks though.
That's
because we do start this chapter with Eddie and Odetta flying down the beach, him pushing her, pumping the wheelchair. Eddie is thinking about how before he left Roland once again, he told him to be on his guard once again. And if she changes back to Odetta, he must brain her immediately. Eddie is thinking about the fact that they now have two quote unquote crippled people and one not crippled person, and miles to go before the end of the beach. And at this point, Eddie points out that their only hope is this wheelchair. This wheelchair is their only hope, because the plan is to take Odetta to the door, leave her, take the wheelchair back, pick up Roland, and then wheel back to the door as fast as possible because Roland can't even walk anymore.
Yeah.
So, Matt, if Odetta had not gotten her legs chopped off, Roland would have died here.
Yeah, it's kind of a hilariously literal reading, but you could say that Eddie and Odetta were drawn because Roland would need a wheelchair and somebody strong enough to push a wheelchair. I don't really believe that that's the reason, but it is kind of funny.
Yeah, I don't think that's the reason either. But I mean, it does. We were just talking about Ka and this kind of symmetry that's happening here, and it is interesting. Like when we had Odetta's accident last week, we talked about the idea that things were pushed or moved in a certain way to make sure that this accident happens and she survives the accident. So it's like we cause still this mystery, but it seems like forces, or it could just be coincidence, but it seems like forces are moving to make sure things happen because the wheelchair is their hope. Without the wheelchair, they would have no hope. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
So we then, once again, flash back to slightly before the moment that begins this chapter. Eddie is talking to Roland right after he has woken up from fainting. He tells Eddie to feed Odetta as they'll need her to have her strength, and he makes sure not to tell her about Detta. And here we see that Odetta has invented an entire backstory for why she hasn't been eating. She's allergic to the lobstrosities, and every time that they've tried to feed her some, she's thrown it up. Eddie manages to convince her to try again, and she finally does, and she realizes that she loves it, and then invents the story that, we must be further down the beach, it must be a different species, and I'm not allergic to this one. I love, how flimsy this lie is. It's so, you almost kind of believe that she doesn't even buy it herself.
Yeah, I love the description of how she says this bullshit with this expression of, complete open guilelessness. And Eddie's just stunned. It's so good. And Eddie's, you really empathize with Eddie's awkwardness as he's like, yeah, that must be it. Sure.
Yeah.
And then the click when he swallows, which indicates his nervousness. And then that becomes a motif that introduced here. And then we get another beat of it later on.
Sure. Yeah. That's a good thing to point out. Yeah. I mean, I love there's no way I'm going to be able to keep it down, Eddie. And he's like, just try again for me.
Yeah.
It's really great. But I mean, this brings us back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, where we gonna compare and contrast the lies that Detta Walker and Odetta Holmes tell themselves. And it is very interesting to compare this. We look at what Detta saw. Detta is all violence done to her by external forces. These people tied her up. They raped her, she says, which definitely never happens, but she's decided that's what happens because sexual violence is something very specific to Detta Walker. They tortured her with food. Everything is these things that these people have done to her. Odetta, on the other hand, explains all it away as her fault. She's tied to the chair because it's a measure of keeping her spilling out, and it's her fault. The hunger must be her fault. It's not that anyone was starving her. It's just she was eating, but she couldn't keep it down. She's allergic. It's all internal for her. It's all coming from her.
Yeah, I love that. Detta externalizes blame. Odetta internalizes blame. And when you frame it that way, I really think it does suggest that this idea is close to the primary cleavage between these two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it also kind of supports this idea that Detta came about, and we still don't know this for sure, but if it is indeed the brick that created Detta, then Detta came about at a point where Odetta was made victim by an external force, mm-hmm. and could not process that, and so created a new personality to externalize blame, mm-hmm. Because she couldn't.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So both of them share the same fear of Roland, though, which they both, Detta called her the very bad man, but Odetta still is afraid of her. And Detta will later tell us why, is because Roland invaded her mind, but also made her realize that this wasn't the first time that someone had invaded her mind. Roland, to both of these women, represents the truth of their situation, and that scares them so much that they shy away from him. And won't go near him. I think Odetta says she doesn't even want to touch anything that's been touched by him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Odetta sees that there's something semi-supernatural about her situation, but she places that feeling on Roland instead of on herself. And I wanted to point out here that we don't hear any more of that, like, oh, this isn't really happening, I'm having a hallucination talk from Odetta. She appears to have just dropped that whole frame of mind. And I think this is related to her ability to just confabulate plausible stories. Like, okay, she's still with Roland and Eddie, and that must be because she wants to be, and she's accepted everything, and they're all friends now.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful, and I think it maybe hints towards an idea that while she does not retain awareness and memory of the times in which Odetta was in charge, it's there, and she's using that data to construct stuff. Because one of my favorite parts of this lie is that in order for Odetta to construct this believable reality around the lack of consciousness for the past few days, she has to be in a situation where she's been hanging out and bonding with Eddie for days. Like, they only had one very brief, 10-minute conversation, and then that's it. And now they've been hanging out for days. So Odetta has to construct this reality. And this chapter sees them consummate their feelings for each other. And sees their friendship move into this whole new phase. But they haven't really ever hung out. But Odetta presumably pulls from what she's seen of Eddie via Detta and constructs their relationship whole cloth to make this lie work. It's fascinating.
Yeah. It's like her fantasy Eddie is doing the things that real Eddie would have been doing if Odetta had been around the whole time.
Yeah.
Rather than putting on a clown suit and just jumping around, it's not just some random other thing. It's what Eddie would have actually done. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it really is.
But yeah, I mean, I don't want to take anything away from this beautiful budding relationship, but it's worth pointing out that it's kind of fake because, like you pointed out, her memories of most of their interactions, and most of their growing closeness are fabrications.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right, and I don't want to take anything away from it either because I find it very touching and beautiful. But that is true. And I think maybe that's why, a little bit later, we'll see Eddie tell Odetta, "I love you." And she's like, well, I'm not quite there yet.
Right.
And maybe that's why, is because there is some recognition here that, this is mostly constructed memory.
Yeah, maybe so. Possibly.
So while still in the flashback, Roland explains the plan, and we talked about this already, that Eddie will take Odetta up the beach moving as fast as possible. When they find the third door, he will leave her there and then come back for Roland, pushing him up the beach as well. Roland gives Eddie his gun, who promptly tells him that he's going to leave the gun with Odetta when he comes back. And Roland, flips the fuck out.
Yep.
At this moment, the gunslinger's eyes blazed so brightly that Eddie snapped his head back as if Roland had thrust a flaming torch in his face. Gods, yes! Leave her with a loaded gun when her other might come back at any time. Are you insane? I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
It's again, we have this recurring motif of just of this Eddie who is kind of just childishly naive about the dangers of their situation.
Yeah, specifically her. I mean,
yeah. He's kind of blinded by love a little bit.
I think that's exactly what it is, and I think that's deeply thematic, right? Because Roland is struggling with this idea that he seems to actually be this. The story even calls him a romantic at some point during this week's reading. He struggles with easily falling in love with people, basically, and that being something that he can't afford to do because the world always punishes him for that. And Eddie is also someone who easily falls in love with people, and it causes him to make these sorts of, I guess you could call them mistakes. And I think that's an idea that the book is putting front and center and playing with quite a bit with all these characters.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. I like that a lot. So they argue a bit more, and I think going back to the earlier conversation we had about the brotherly love between these two men, there's this beautiful passage where it's just still about the gun, where Eddie says, "Very logical. You're still a fucking shit, however. Go or stay. Stop calling me names." You forgot something, Eddie said furiously. What was that? You forgot to tell me to grow up. That's what Henry always used to say. Oh, grow up, kid. The gunslinger had smiled, a weary, oddly beautiful smile. I think you have grown up. Will you go or stay? I'll go, Eddie said. What are you going to eat? She scarfed the leftovers. The fucking shit will find a way. The fucking shit has been finding one for years.
Yeah, that passage really stuck out to me as well. I think you can't help but feel the love behind the anger on both sides.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is the part where you're talking about where he once again directly compares Roland to his brother. He's being talked to the same way Henry talks to him. And of course we know that relationship was not healthy for Eddie. The relationship with Henry was not healthy for Eddie. So the more he's compared to Henry, I think it shows the agitation on Eddie, but I wonder if it shows the unhealthiness of this relationship.
Possibly. I mean, I don't want to believe that.
Me neither. I said that, and it felt dirty in my mouth because I was like, no, I love their friendship.
I think that King has done something very smart, if cruel, by starting this story out with the Roland Jake relationship, where now you're like, okay, well, he's willing to just stab us in the gut and leave us to die by the side of the literary road. So he could very well be setting us up for that exact same thing again, or something similar, or something worse. But I still don't want it to happen. I guess we'll see. I do love how like Eddie's so furious with him, but he still says like, "What are you gonna eat?" You know, he's still concerned with him, even though he's furious with him. That's just the perfect like touch of love under the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. I love him. I don't like, sometimes being analytical means you have to be harsher on the characters you love than you want to, and I don't want to, but the Roland.
Yeah.
So back in the present, Eddie and Odetta are racing across the sand. They finally stop to rest for the night, and Odetta points to a shining star in the west across the water. They look at it and they hold each other and they make their wishes. And we see both their wishes. This is King kind of leaves the close third person, and we kind of see the thought process of both of them, which we haven't really seen a lot of Odetta here, but they both say, have the wish I wish tonight. And Eddie's wish is, please, always you. And her wish is, if I must die in this odd place, please let it be not too hard, and let this good young man be with me. And I think that is interesting because this is also, they're about to hook up. And they're clearly in different places in as far as the seriousness of this relationship, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's head over heels. He's completely besotted, and she's
she
just
likes him.
Yeah. He's nice. Yeah.
I do like hers is resigned to her fate. He's not thinking like, if I must die in this odd place, like it's an inevitability. But at least don't have it be too hard on me, and let it be with this kid.
Yeah. It's we'll see.
Yeah. So later that same night, they make love. So Matt, how do you feel about these two crazy kids getting together?
It's nice. They haven't known each other very long, and there are some concerning implications with the whole fabricated memories thing. But frankly, I'm having a hard time being all skeptical and judgmental about it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they say events bring people together, and what could be more unifying than being yanked through a magical door by a cowboy?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I feel like it would be easy to just nitpick and be like, well, this is just doomed but I'm just like, I don't really feel the need to do that. I think it's just kind of a sweet moment in the story.
I agree. And we'll see where it goes from there, because like I said, I think they are have different minds about what that moment meant, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
The next morning, they continue on, eventually spotting the door. And we get this great moment where Odetta sees it well before Eddie. And Eddie notes that her eyes may be as good as Roland's, maybe even better, which I think is another little hint of gunslinger qualities for Odetta here.
Yeah, or maybe Eddie just needs glasses and is just like really, really in denial about it.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I don't think so.
Holy shit, you can read that stop sign? It's like 15 feet away, Eddie.
Poor Eddie. Eddie doesn't need glasses. Eventually, though, they do reach the door, Matt. And this beautiful passage here. They simply looked at it. Odetta in her chair with her hands in her lap, Eddie on the seaside. In one way, they looked as if they had looked at the evening star the previous night, which is to say, as children look at things. But in another, they looked differently. When they wished on the star, they had been children of joy. Now they were solemn, wondering, like children looking at a stark embodiment of a thing which only belonged in a fairy tale.
Yeah, I mean this is like really cool because in contrast to the pragmatic, no nonsense, completely free of wonder way in which Roland approached Eddie's door, we see this from the perspective of these characters who are not used to this kind of thing, and they see it as a fairy tale object, and it's the whole writing style is different. Even it's really gorgeous.
Yeah, and it is gorgeous, and I love the motif of children, right? When they looked at the star, they were children of joy, where they saw a beautiful thing and they were childishly like wishing upon it and wondering at it. Here, they're looking at another thing and they're looking solemn and wondering, but they're still children, but children looking at the stark embodiment of a thing which only belonged in a fairy tale. I love that. Like, it is interesting that King is painting the drawn in a childish manner, and of course, like it's the whole fish out of water thing. Like, they are going to be infantilized a little bit just by the fact that they're so completely unfamiliar with this thing. But it seems a recurring motif. We are outlining the childishness of them in these moments of awe and wonder.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's cool because Roland was a fish out of water in our world, but his reaction was always to just be continually pragmatic and, immediate concerns oriented, whereas they are fish out of water in his world and they see it as magic and wonder.
Yeah, I mean, I think Roland reacted to the tall buildings with a sense of kind of childish wonder.
Sure.
So,
yeah, I guess that's true.
That's not entirely true, but I know what you mean, though. Like, Roland has a mission, and even as he wonders at the craziness of our world, like, he's still very mission focused.
Yeah, and one thing that does sort of try to sort of drive him toward a poetic bent is anytime he thinks about the tower, he starts thinking in language that is a lot less pragmatic and a lot more poetic.
Sure, that's true. So King tells us that there are 2 words written on the door, which is odd because we were expecting just one: death. We'll discuss those words a little bit more in a bit, but it is interesting to me, Matt, that King hides them from us here. Both our characters are looking at them, but we don't get to see them until Roland does. I think King is basically just kind of screwing with us here. He's allowing this to build a certain tension. We do see that these words mean something specific to both Eddie and Odetta. They have a very specific reaction to them, but we don't get to see what they are. How do you feel about this, like, this intentional, withholding of these words?
In terms of the withholding, I think it's fun. Honestly, like I'm excited. I want to get further ahead, and I think mainly though I want to see Roland's reaction, and I think that's why he withholds it, because Eddie and Odetta reading the pusher, they're just going to be like, huh, I don't know, but to Roland's the one who's going to read that and be like, well, that's not right. It's not supposed to say that, and that's the thought that we have too. So I think it makes sense to wait until Roland sees it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a certain truth to the fact that these doors belong to Roland. I think in this moment they test it to see if they can open it, and it won't open for them because it is not their door. It is Roland's door, and therefore it is kind of poetic that we don't get to see what the door says until Roland does. Yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, just to talk about the idea of the pusher, which we haven't quite learned yet, but it asks all these questions. Like, is the pusher also death? Mm-hmm. Is that, are we meant to assume it's the same thing? And okay, a pusher of what? And then of course the idea of a pusher touches on the idea of addiction, which is what Eddie struggles with, and Roland's obsession for that matter. I think one mystery is that, like, what could this mean for Odetta? What is the connection to Odetta? Because I kind of, at this point, expect there to be connections between these characters. And, like, all I could really think of at this point was, like, well, somebody's got to push the wheelchair, but that just kind of seems silly.
Yeah, I mean, someone pushed her in that subway, right?
That's true. That's probably a better connection, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right though, and I think I think we'll talk about that more when Roland does see them. But
yeah,
I do, like, normally, we've talked about this on other books before, that this like intentional withholding of information just for the sake of a more powerfully landed reveal later is a thing that kind of annoys me sometimes, because like we've been in these characters' heads, we've been hearing their thoughts, they're standing here, they like study this door. Like, it is interesting that King goes through this practice of having the two of them test the door in much the same way that Roland did the first time he saw it, where they like walk behind it until the point that it just magically vanishes, and they go through that whole process in a lot of detail with the two of them again. He basically repeats that with these two, and yet this entire time the book denies us what is on the door, and normally that is something that bothers me. It does not bother me here, and I think it's because of what we were talking about, because of this concept of this is Roland's door, those are Roland's words, they belong to him, and it is only right that we don't get to see them until he does.
Yeah, I like all that.
Mm-hmm. All right, so as they prepare for Eddie to leave to go get Roland, he offers her the gun, Matt, because fucking course he does.
Yep.
And she says no at first, both knowing that Roland will be mad, and then later saying that thing we talked about earlier, that she is afraid to touch anything that belongs to him or that he touches. But then that creepy mutant wildcat growls again, and he changes he's like, nope, I don't care what you say, I'm giving it to you. And she finally accepts it.
Yeah, it's great how insistent she is that she not take it. And like several times he tries and she refuses, and you're like, okay, good, he's not going to give it to her. Yeah. And then the wildcat screams at just the wrong moment, is it Ka? And it causes him to change his mind.
I don't know. Is it Ka? I mean, and that's like a rhetorical question, right? Like, there's no answer to that.
Right.
Like, I could say yes, and it would have just as much weight as no.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I did think is funny is that King, especially in these moments, seems to be reinforcing the age differences between these two. When Odetta thinks about Eddie, it's always this young man. And then during the argument over the gun, she reminds Eddie of his third grade teacher. And I don't think we know Odetta's age exactly, but I do think we know that she is older than Eddie by not just a few years. Why do you think King is doing this?
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot going on between all these characters. Like, I'm just going to draw some lines for a second. Eddie sees Roland as a big brother. Roland sees Eddie as sometimes an older Jake. Sometimes Roland sees himself as a court figure and a mentor to Eddie. Eddie sees Odetta as a lover and also like an older authority figure. Odetta slightly condescendingly sees Eddie as a young man first and foremost, but not so young that it's weird to sleep with him. And then there's Detta, who sees Roland as a monster, and Roland sees her as this cunning evil creature with useful potential. And like, there's so many complex interrelationships going on here. So in terms of why this specific one, why is it that they're lovers, but there's also this element of an age difference between them? I don't know.
I personally think it's to emphasize how much further Eddie has fallen in love with Odetta than the other way around. That it is specific to show, like, to Eddie, she is this like powerful woman that I'm like in love with. To Odetta, look at this young man. Look at this cute young man.
He's sweet.
That I like. Yeah, he's a sweet young man. To me, it's kind of this idea that Odetta is still split, and I don't think a fractured person can truly love Eddie in the way in which she loves him, because she's only half of herself, right? So there's something to that for me, and I think maybe this reinforces that like she's not going to be able to feel the way he feels, as half of a person.
It makes a lot of sense to me. We get many beats of Eddie thinking about how he's fallen in love with her.
Yeah.
From her side, not so much. So
yeah, definitely. All right. Eddie makes his way back to Roland, who realizes right away that Eddie gave her the gun, and he's about as pissed off as you would expect. But after a short rest, they head off together anyway. And of course, this is much more difficult for Eddie this time, not only because he's tired, but because Roland is a big fatty and he weighs way more than Odetta does. Despite all of that, though, the men have bonded with. There's this great moment that's like, "Do you still want to kill me?" And Eddie says, "No, I don't want to kill you." And that's progress, baby.
True love.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, Roland is definitely pissed, but he's pissed in a like resigned way, like fucking course you did.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So after a 2-day journey, they arrive at the door, only to find that Odetta has mysteriously vanished.
Shocking. Who could have predicted this other than Roland and us?
Yeah. I like, again, we go back to this moment that started this week's reading, which is the be on your guard, Eddie. Be on your guard. And he just isn't listening. He doesn't get it.
Yep. Yep.
So while Eddie is like frantically screaming for Odetta and imagining that the absolute worst has happened, we see that Roland is like completely enraptured by the door. And this is when we finally get to hear what it says. The gunslinger, meanwhile, had been studying the third door. He had expected a single word, the word the man in black had used as he turned the 6th tarot card at the Dusty Golgotha, where they had held palaver. Death, Walter had said, but not for you, gunslinger. There was not one word writ upon this door, but 2, and neither of them was death. He read it again, lips moving soundlessly. The pusher. Yet it means death, Roland thought, and knew it was so. So this, Matt, is a pretty classic 3-beat that King has established here. And for those that don't know, I don't think everyone calls it a 3-beat. That's a term that I use and I've heard other places, but basically the rule of 3, right? The rule of 3 is very important in storytelling. The basic formula for this is you establish something, you confirm it again, so you have it again to confirm the meaning of it, and then in your third beat, you subvert it in some kind of way. So in this story, we've established that the name on the door matches the card. With the first one, prisoner, we confirm that again with the second door, Lady of Shadows. But now here we are with the third card and the third door, and we have subverted that expectation. It is not death on the door, but the pusher. So automatically, we can assume that this door is going to be different, and perhaps that this drawing is going to be different.
Yeah, King. I think he's used a bunch of 3-beats. I think the idea of a 3-beat or the rule of 3 is kind of a codified way of talking about what I see as the principal rule of storytelling, which is to set up expectations and then use those expectations to create surprise. Mm-hmm. Because a story where you set up expectations and then fulfill those expectations exactly as set up is just boring and formulaic and nothing. So King does this over and over. We've talked a lot about the idea that the book is just endlessly inventive and surprising because he's always sort of subtly leading you to expect A and then giving you B.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely what this is. And so, yeah, I feel pretty confident that everything that we've been led to understand about the way these doors work and the way these drawing candidates work is going to be thrown out the window for this one.
Yeah. And that we get back to the conversation we were talking about before. What does the pusher mean? Because Roland says here, yet it means death, Roland thought, and knew it was so. This was not just an idle speculation of Roland. This is a full belief. The pusher means death anyway. So it is not directly the tarot card, but it is related to it. And then, of course, we got to talk about Odetta, who was pushed around by someone and was pushed in front of a subway train. For Eddie, a pusher is a drug dealer. And what does pusher mean for Roland, though? Like, we've seen that it has a meaning to Odetta. We've seen that it has a meaning to Eddie, but this is Roland's door. He says it means death, but how so?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, we've seen that the death tarot card doesn't actually mean death in tarot,
right,
but rather change, which can be a positive thing.
Yeah.
And also the death isn't for him. So it's change for someone, not him, maybe. Mm-hmm. Like change for another member of the group, positive change. I don't know. I feel like this is underdefined than I think it's supposed to be.
Yeah. I mean, do you have any prediction at all what's going to be behind this door? Where is Roland going?
No. I mean, I had at least a wrong prediction last week. I don't even know where it came from, honestly. But I have no guess. Like I don't even know if it's going to be a person. Like maybe it's something else. I don't know.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great place to be, though. I think that's a fun place to be, and that's kind of probably why it was so difficult for you to stop once you were reading.
Absolutely.
All right, so Eddie starts to make his way into the hills to look for Odetta, which finally manages to pull Roland away from the door. And what follows here, Matt, is like a really super extremely tense standoff between these two characters as Roland demands that Eddie come with him through the door, and they argue back and forth about that, and they argue back and forth about Odetta's fate. And Eddie is kind of making more and more absurd stories to explain why she's missing. Like, I think at one point is like, well, the cat got her, but it dragged her away and didn't kill her to save her for later. And Roland is like, that's not what wild cats do. That's at all. And like, it's just like more like, well, maybe like she killed it at the same time, so she's off there hurt, like she shot the gun at it at the same time and she's injured. And it's like this completely preposterous chain of events to make it so he can deflect away from the thing he knows is the truth, is that Detta is back, and thanks to Eddie, she's packing iron.
There's something happening in these pages that I really want to highlight, which is happening throughout this section, where I feel like some traits are slipping between characters, because Eddie uses the phrase "a very trying day" a couple of times, actually, which is wording that Odetta used to facetiously describe her time in Oxford to herself. It was a trying 3 days. And so this word, this term, this phrasing has moved from Odetta to Eddie somehow.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And now here Eddie is like confabulating this elaborate story to explain something that Odetta has done, when the obvious explanation is that it was just something that Detta has done. So like it's like he's subconsciously, maybe magically, who knows, like taking on these traits of Odetta.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I never put that together, but that is exactly what's happening. Detta has taken control, and it has caused a blank space where Odetta's supposed to be, and Eddie is inventing a story to explain why that happened, which is exactly what Odetta does every time she loses herself. Yeah, I think that's great. I never put that together, but I love that so much.
Cool. I mean, I wonder if we're going anywhere else with this idea of traits passing between people, because so far I've only really noticed it going from Odetta to Eddie specifically. Yeah,
I mean, I think, like without any magic, that's going to happen as people hang out with each other a lot, right? Like you're just gonna rub off on people in different ways. The more you are around each other, especially when your entire life is like these three people day after day doing nothing but hanging out with each other.
Yeah, using certain words becomes copacetic suddenly.
Yeah, there doesn't have to be a supernatural element behind it, but there certainly could be. Yeah. Cool. Love it. So it's just a great little moment, because Roland is like, he's tired and like he's sitting in the wheelchair because he can barely stand. He's sick with fever. His throat hurts, and he's like, Eddie, please come a little closer. Come closer so I don't have to shout. And Eddie like has sniffed this out like immediately and is like, what big eyes you have, Grandma.
Yeah.
And it's a completely throwaway reference that Roland does not understand at all. But he's right. He's like saying, you're tricking me. You're trying to get me close enough to where you can grab me and throw me through the door with you so I don't chase after Odetta. And he's totally right, because then we switch to Roland's point of view, and Eddie says, could be you laying back in the tall grass just a little bit. Could be I am, Roland said, unsmiling, and added, but I'm not. He was, though. A little.
Yeah, despite all the good things and all the bonding between them, Roland is still just going to grab the kid if he needs to.
Right. I mean, I find that just fascinating that like this section, like we talked about at the beginning, this section created a bond between these two characters through their common annoyance with a third party, with an enemy. And we've seen them bond. We've seen the clapping on the shoulder. We've seen laughing and smiling and friendship and maybe mentor-mentee relationship forming. And still at the end of this, Roland is willing to just trick him into doing what he wants him to do.
And crucially, Eddie is correctly suspicious of him, despite the fact that they do have this love between them.
Right. So, it's so funny that like, be on your guard, Eddie, has been this constant refrain throughout these two chapters. And Eddie is constantly not on his guard around Odetta/Detta, but he is constantly on his guard around Roland.
Mm-hmm.
It's great.
I love that. Yeah, because now I'm thinking back, like, yeah, I guess it has been pretty consistent actually that he never there hasn't really been a point where he let Roland hoodwink him that I can think of off the top of my head. So
I mean, unless you are speaking of the drawing specifically, but that shouldn't even count because like there are cops pounding on the door. Come with me or go to jail forever.
I think he was honest. I think Roland was he said like, yeah, we'll probably die.
Yeah, you're right. That wasn't even a hoodwink. That was just total honesty. Yeah, totally. Yeah. All right. Well, we briefly cut away from this whole standoff up to the person we knew was here. Detta is back, and she's indeed up in the hills with the gun, watching this whole thing play out. We see this is the moment where she explains why she hates the really bad man, which we already talked about earlier. But the interesting thing that I wanted to draw your attention to here is she's sitting here and she's describing this place where she's hiding as the drawers, capital D, as in this is a location. And this is a place that Detta has actually described before. When we first saw her back in that big, like, page long paragraph, it's the place where she was when she broke the 4 special plate. The drawers, a smoking, trash littered hole in the earth where she had once seen a burning baby with plastic skin. So this is a place, but Detta, maybe in her confusion, is like thinking this is the same place, or maybe it has more meaning.
I have no fucking idea what's going on here, to be honest. like is she physically somewhere else? Like, does Detta have a personal pocket dimension? Like what? I mean, I will say that I think I predicted that the word drawers would be used in this context.
Yes, you did.
But and she also connected it to like pants, like drawers or pants that you take on and put off. But anyway, I don't know what's happening with the drawers here, and I wonder. I mean, I think we're gonna resolve some Detta mysteries at some point, but I'm pretty curious about that.
Yeah. I mean, I Detta is like such a complex individual with like where she is and where she's not. That I think this is. I pulled it out here because like I think when you read it, it capitalizes it here, which almost draws your attention to it. Like this is not just like a description of a general idea of a place. This is a capital D place. Like this is somewhere that she is saying she's in right now.
I think
and she's trying to pull them up in here. She's trying to draw them into the drawers.
I love it. Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why I might have missed it the first time through, because I am doing the audiobook, leaning on that pretty heavily, and so I miss the capitalization. I don't notice that it's this distinct thing I'm supposed to be paying attention to. Yeah. So sorry about that.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine. That's what I'm here for.
All right.
So Roland explains to Eddie that by shooting his gun, he's like desperate to try to convince Eddie how dangerous this whole situation is by shooting his gun. And he's like, look, like she has a gun like this, and these were the most wet bullets, which means she definitely has a loaded gun there. And Eddie is still channeling his inner Odetta here, making stories about why this could all be a trick, right? You could have held back one shell you knew was live. I wouldn't put it past you. And when he said that, he knew it would be true. He wouldn't put that or anything else past Roland. His tower, his goddamn tower.
Mm-hmm. It's great.
It's great. It really is. Yeah. But I think interestingly enough here, Roland does relent. Like we talked about his willingness to kind of ignore the desire of the people that are in his, I almost said employ, but that's not really true. His company.
Yeah.
And make them do what he needs them to do. But here he finally gives up and he relents. And he tosses the gun over. He tosses the other gun over to Eddie. And I love that in that moment, it immediately makes Eddie ashamed of the doubts that he has. Like he feels super bad about it.
Yeah. I mean, Eddie was right, but in the end, Roland isn't willing to be as cruel as maybe he could have been.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't turn the gun on Eddie, for example, although that's because he can't actually. But
yeah, I mean, can't kill him. Yeah.
Like, yeah, there's so much delicious ambiguity to their relationship, though, and they're kind of aware of that ambiguity, and that makes it even more exciting.
Yeah, definitely.
There was this phrase that Roland used a few times. He was talking about cleaning the gun, and it was like, break the machine, clean the machine. And I just thought like the fact that it was repeated so many times, I thought was really interesting. I don't have any master theory behind like why other than the obvious literal, just like, yeah, he's talking about cleaning the gun, but like like Roland seeing himself as a gun, as a weapon, is something that I've thought of, and the idea that like if it gets compromised, it needs to be broken down and cleaned. I was trying to connect something to this relating to Roland's sense of himself as a person, like he needs to keep himself clean of attachments, perhaps. I feel like I might be reaching, but I also feel like it's something that I want to pay attention to going forward. Any kind of like rituals that Roland has associated with the gun, and then try to map those onto how he sees himself.
Yeah, no, I like that a whole bunch. I don't think that's reaching. I think you're onto something there, and I think we definitely should pay attention to that.
Cool.
Yeah, that repetition was really powerful for me as well. Break the machine, clean the machine, break the machine, clean the machine.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the moment where he relents and turns the gun over to Eddie, he says, like, he's already fired wet ammunition, and says that every time you fire wet ammunition, you have to clean the gun or you're going to wreck it. But he tosses the gun over to Eddie and doesn't clean it. He's like, it's probably going to be fine. And I wonder if that's like symbolic of him breaking from the machinery of Tower Quest, and that, you know, that might be too much of a reach.
Well,
but
I like it. I like it a lot. I mean, he's starting to tolerate a little bit of grit, little bit of imperfection on his pristine sense of who he is. I like it.
Cool, great. But this section ends with Roland standing up, struggling. It's not easy for him. He can barely stand, but he gets out of the wheelchair and he walks through the pusher door and disappears through the door. And as we leave this week's reading, we have the same words that started it. Remember, Eddie, be on your guard. And I love in this moment, like as soon as Roland has left, despite all the lies that he was telling himself, despite all the protests he put up, Eddie immediately realizes that of course it's Detta out there. He's like, he feels like that there's someone else here with him, and he knows it's Detta. It's really great.
Yeah, I love it.
So that is the end of the section, Matt. You made a few predictions throughout the show. Do you have any more before we move on?
No, just kind of the ones that came up as we were going along. Don't have any more.
I love that you don't have a prediction for the third door, because it makes it so much fun. I can't wait. You have to message me as you're reading the next session. That's required.
I'll try. I was probably going to start listening like literally as soon as I hung up on you. So
okay, well then don't message me because I'll be busy.
Okay.
All right, so let's move to our audience discussion question this week. Only a couple answers to this one, which is fine because it was difficult. One person's answer was just I don't know, which is fair. This is a tough question, but the question was, one of Odetta's defining characteristics is being part of the movement for civil rights for people of color. Why do you think King chose to explore this idea in this book? And our one answer came from Sarah Penguin, who said, Odetta is someone who could have avoided a lot of the issues of racism with money, as people might not like her, but they won't do much to, as shown by the luggage being beaten, but not her. So choosing to put herself in those situations shows that she is someone who is passionate and someone who wants to get things done rather than just pay everyone to do it for her. It also gives the image that she is someone with a sense of justice and righteousness. Her asking her dad about his past and going to concerts might suggest she is looking for connections or to belong to something. She does mention the singing we and being we. The willingness to stand up to racists that probably want her dead shows that she has the same steel that Eddie has, and that she's also stubborn. I like that a whole lot. It's really good.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I love it.
So what is your take on this? Why do you think that King chose to frame the struggle for civil rights in what can be safely said as one of the major characters of this book?
So the best I can do on this, and maybe I need to, maybe we just need more of Detta and Odetta before we really understand what the point is here. But I think about the contrast between nonviolent resistance and sort of violence, or the contrast between like stolid, like I said earlier, kind of a sanguine approach to it. Like I'm just gonna get through it. I'm gonna spend the time in the Oxford prison, and I'm not gonna tell anybody how much it hurts, versus being actively resentful and raging at the people who do these things. It's an exploration of the different ways that a person can react, internalize and externalize but both the abuse that they receive due to, racism, and also the kind of way in which they protest that. And where it's going, I don't know, but that's kind of where I'm looking at it right now, is an examination of the internalization and externalization of racism in a person.
Sure. I like that. I do. One of the things I think is so fascinating about it is like when we take a step back and we look at Eddie, Eddie as representative of addiction and Roland's addiction for the tower. I wonder if we look back at Odetta and her struggle for civil rights as a representation of other moments of who Roland is and his past. Like I think if we look back at the good man Farson and the things we learned about that struggle back in The Gunslinger, there was a contingent that thought they were fighting to overthrow the old ways of oppression to bring a new kind of peace and or freedom to the land that they lived in. And Roland was representative, or at least Roland through his power and his lineage was representative of that status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not trying to say that Farson was right in what they were doing. Obviously, they were poisoning meat and feeding it to children, so that's fucking terrible. But I do wonder if we're looking at different aspects of Roland and things that Roland needs to learn about himself if this struggle to the tower is going to be successful. We have a character who represents a struggle for respect and equal treatment and freedom. And that especially to a person like Roland who has robbed many people of that on his way to the tower. I don't know. There's something meaty there for me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That now you get my wheels turning. I don't have anything smart to say right this second, but that's really interesting. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, that's just what I thought about it. But we appreciate the answer to the question, Sarah Penguin. I liked yours as well, Matt. There's a lot going on here with this. I think it is very intentional that King chose to frame this around the civil rights movement. He did not have to do that. And I don't think it's just I feel like supporting the civil rights movement in 1987, right. So I'm gonna write about it.
And I don't think it's just it's just a setting. It doesn't mean anything.
Right. Absolutely not. Yeah. That kind of leads us into our discussion question for this week, Matt, which is again going to be about Detta and Odetta. It seems only fair. And I want to talk about how Detta's sense of justice and Odetta's sense of justice differ. We kind of drew some differences in them a little bit this week, but how do they view justice in at least in your interpretation of what you've seen in these two characters so far? And because we're going to be reading this at the end of next week's episode, you can use some stuff that you might learn in next week's section to help build that answer. So maybe wait until you finish the book before you answer it as well. Not that I'm spoiling anything, Matt.
I'm sure. All right.
Let's see. Where was I going to do? Oh, we do have one email I wanted to quickly read to you, Matt. We got an email from a listener that I really liked, and it's talking about how great Roland is, and I'm a sucker for that. So we got an email from Lynette B, who it's titled "In Defense of Roland," and Lynette is basically talking about how she was a little bit surprised at not our reaction, not your reaction, but our talk about how some of our listeners had a very negative reaction to Roland. And not that she's saying they're wrong for feeling that way, but that she loves Roland and wanted to explain to us why. And she says, I have loved Roland without qualification since my first read, partly because he is such a brilliant mix of compassion and single-minded pursuit. I think an important thing to remember in thinking about Roland and whether or not we like him is that he isn't us. He isn't what we would want to be. We aren't meant to look at him and think, I would like to think I would do those things if I were in that position. He's not a hero in the traditional fantasy sense. We all want to think we could be as strong as Frodo, but no one wants to think they would be as strong as Roland. We can compare their respective losses. That's a spoiler. Wait, no, it's not a spoiler. We can compare their respective losses of fingers later. Unlike Frodo, who knows exactly what he's doing and why, saving the world, Roland only knows his destination. The difference in knowledge is important because it affects how we see free will in the story, and in turn, how much we like his character. Some readers respond negatively to Roland letting Jake die, but he has no choice. He's lost literally everything on the path to his destination, and will do it again because he has to. If he doesn't sacrifice again, then the meaning of all his previous sacrifices is diminished. He loses himself in keeping Jake, and it's too great of a loss to endure. If we impose too much free will on him, then yes, he becomes something heartless, and there's too much evidence of his heart to think of him as much. There's more here. It's a really excellent email, Lynette. Thank you for sending it. But I really liked those general ideas there.
I adore the idea that we all want to think that we could be as strong as Frodo, but we don't want to think we could be as strong as Roland. Because it's like that's a kind of strength that's frightening. The strength to be able to turn your back on a child in need. It's like, that's a kind of strength for sure. It's not something we think of as admirable though.
Yeah, and I think it's a very believable, slippery slope too, where once you make the first sacrifice, stopping here makes that sacrifice not worth it.
It's great.
And one more thing she says here, I do not mean that his diminished sense of free will absolves him, merely that he cannot be evaluated on the same moral scale we would evaluate ourselves. Moral scale. I can't talk. In any case, Jake absolves him for us. I take Jake's final lines, "Go then, there are other worlds than these," at face value. He's not happy about it, but he's also saying, fine, I don't know what's out there, but I know this isn't the end. You can't end me, even if this is the end of us. Do it. It makes no difference. I had never read it that way, but I really like that a whole lot.
Yeah, it's funny because I do like that, but I feel like the reason I like that is that it allows me to feel less bad about it.
Sure.
And I don't necessarily want to just be like, oh, thank God, a way of not having to be mad at Roland about this, which I desperately want, obviously. But I also don't think King wants us to just be like, yeah, no, he's fine. That didn't matter. You don't have your protagonist do something like that in the first book and then just have it be like, no, but it was okay. It was okay that he did that. It's supposed to be something that he struggles with.
I love the idea of you can't end me even if this is the end of us. I love that. But yeah, I don't think it's meant to absolve Roland. And Roland certainly doesn't take it as being absolved.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that was awesome, Lynette. Thank you. Keep those emails coming. Everyone keep those emails coming. We've been getting a ton of emails from people, and while we're not always going to read them, and I apologize, I am not always going to respond to them, I am reading them at least on my own. If there are ones that I think Matt can read, I'll send them to him, but I'm going to filter those before I send them over to him. So please keep sending them in. It's kingslingerspod@gmail.com. Send your emails, send answers to discussion questions, all the stuff. Please keep sending it in. We love to hear back from our listeners. All right, Matt. That's it for us here this week. We are going to be back this time next week to finish up the Drawing of the Three, Book 2. We're finishing it up next week, Matt. We're going to be covering all of Part 3, The Pusher. It's about 100 pages, so we're going to just do it all in one blow.
Awesome. Remember, you can reach us at, like Scott just said, at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter @doofmedia.
And if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, we really strongly recommend you do so you never miss an episode. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, pretty much all the places. Find us there. And also, we have a lot of listeners of the show that maybe are new to our group, so they might not know what this is. But one of our other shows is a show called Deep Impact. It's done by two of our partners, Elliot and Ruben. And it is a show diving deep into a web serial called Pact by Wildbow. And they're finishing that show up this weekend. And to celebrate the finishing of that show, they're doing a 24-hour live stream event over on our Twitch channel. That's twitch.tv/doofmedia, where they're going to be talking about Pact, just hanging out, doing some ridiculous stuff. They're actually raising money for charity on this whole stream. So if you are listening and you haven't read Pact, maybe just try to tune in for some of it. We'll be there for some of it, but I think it's gonna be a good time. So if you are a Pact reader and haven't heard about this thing yet, oh guys, you got to be there. You got to go. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, it's gonna be a hell of a thing.
Yeah, it's gonna be awesome. I'm so excited about it. Those guys have been working really hard for almost a year and a half now, every week on the show, and it's finally wrapping up for them. So I'm excited for them.
Yeah, it's very emotional too, because
it is.
Yeah, it's awesome. So if you like any of our shows, including this one, and you want to support them, consider donating to our Patreon account at patreon.com/doofmedia. If you donate to us at the $5 level, you can get to hang out with us once a month at our monthly Doof and Chill sessions, as well as a bunch of other great bonuses.
Yeah, we actually just released a little video clip of our last Doof and Chill session over on our YouTube page. So if you're curious about what that means and what we're doing, it's a little like 30-minute clip of us playing the game AI Dungeon, which is just like a text generator based on a... which AI program is it, Matt?
It's GPT-2,
okay.
But it's conditioned on text adventure games.
Yeah. We clipped like the best part of that, which was just absolutely hilarious. So you can check that out now on our YouTube page. Just search Doof Media on YouTube and you'll find it. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun.
I recommend it.
Yes. And we do those every month. So if you like what you see there and you want to support us at that $5 level, you'll get to hang out with us in those sessions. But of course, if you cannot afford to donate to us right now, that is absolutely okay. You can help us out just by sharing this podcast. If you know Stephen King, like if you're buddies with him, maybe just like send him a text and be like, Stephen, check out his podcast.
Yeah.
Or you can help us by leaving us a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Tristan J. Lee, who gives us 5 stars and says, keen for this quartet. I first started listening to Scott and Matt while reading Worm. They provided great insights into the themes and character development in the story that I loved. I'm starting a reread of Dark Tower, and I'm excited to have these guys as a book club in my ear again. The Dark Tower is fantastic and fascinating series, and I'm confident Kingslingers will be a great companion piece to King's opus. Well, thank you very much, Tristan.
Appreciate that.
And thank you to everyone who has left those rating and reviews. They really do help, and they make me feel special, and that's the most important thing of all.
Yeah, me too.
All right, folks, we will see you back here next week as we finish up Book 2, The Drawing of the Three. We're reading Part 3, The Pusher. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.